Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you guys. It's 2:26, so we have about 4 minutes, and then we will get our meeting underway. But yeah, I hope you've been doing well and having a good week so far. And we'll just get this meeting in, and then I guess you guys have a little holiday, which is nice for everyone. Get some time back to just rest and relax. So make yourself comfortable. Hope you got your viewing set up good. And we'll just get started. As always, feel free to chat, say hello, anything else. Hi, Kayla. Good to see you. Good to see you, Flavio and Kenny. It's been a pretty good day. Probably like some of you guys, I'm a little bit tired from the grind of the semester, but that's always a good timing for the Thanksgiving holiday week, so we get a little bit of a breather. Hi, Marissa. Good afternoon. But yeah, things are going pretty smooth over here for me. Just 1 minute, I'll be right back. I'm going to drink myself. Hey, Mateo. Eddie? Kitty's running around. Yeah, the runs have been going all right. It's not my preference, I guess, with the cold weather, but yeah, I've still been going out. I have some all-weather gear for that, like some running tights pretty much, and like thermals and do-rag and like everything, long sleeve shirts. So yes, I've been getting it in. There've been a couple of days lately that have been a little warmer, including right now. So as soon as this class meeting's over, I'll probably go over and hit the track. But yeah, sticking with the runs for sure. I haven't had a PR in a little bit. Maybe earlier in the semester, I had a little more time for more running, but I'm still getting it in. I did 125 miles in October, 117 in September, but I've dropped off a little bit. I'm only at 60 so far for November. Yeah, it's nice to just have a habit of doing something healthy. For me, it's running. Try to eat well too, but we all do our best. Running around 6 a.m. is a good time. Well, that's probably a good time for a lot of people. I know a lot of people in the running community, they swear by get up and get it in early. Me, I'm a little less traditional with that. I hate early mornings, and so I'm always the person that usually will get it in sometime in the afternoon or later in the even early evening. Because I like to just know that everything else is done and I can just focus on my run instead of thinking, okay, well, this has just got to get over with so I can move on to the next thing. But, everyone has their different schedule or preference. Play volleyball with the homies, but all the nets got taken down. Yeah, same kind of with, I used to play a lot of basketball and stuff with my friends on the weekends, but nowadays we really can't get together. We can't do that. So it's all right. There's always PlayStation, NBA Live. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. So it's now 2:30. I'm going to just get us started. Basically, it's our last meeting before Thanksgiving break, as everyone knows. So next week, we have a solid week off. But there's still a little bit more left in the class. So we got one more chapter that we're going to study. That's chapter 9, and we'll get that started today. There are 3 meetings on that. So 1 meeting today, and then 2 meetings in the week when we come back. After that, we'll be in week 15, I believe, and at that point, we just have 2 review sessions and the final exam. But good to see Joshua and everybody else that's showing up here, Megan and everyone, Tamara. Thank you, guys. But yeah, so we're going to finish up the rest of the class. We'll talk about chapter 9. You just had your third quiz on Monday, so thanks everybody for taking the quiz and for all your study and preparation. I'm definitely grading those along with the last homework that you did, and I just need a little bit of additional time to finish it, but it'll all be done within this week. So I'll send you guys an announcement when I'm done with the grading over the weekend, and then you can come to me with an email for your grade check. And I'll also distribute the directions for the last homework assignment during the Thanksgiving break. According to the schedule, it's due Monday the 7th of December, so that's the Monday of week 15. And we're going to pretty much stick to that date, so you're going to have at least 2 weeks to work on it after when I distribute it. So I'm going to distribute it no later than Monday, and you get about 2 weeks to work on it. You'll get more, in-depth details about it when I send the announcement, but just so you understand the preview, to get my thinking about it, it's going to be basically critical analysis of some viewing of a media broadcast of like news. So you're going to have to find some TV show that shows the news, right, from whatever station or from whatever channel. You're going to have to watch at least 30 minutes of it, and then you'll have to write a little short, brief report where you basically critically analyze it using all the tools that you've learned throughout the course and throughout the semester. So trying to find fallacies, misleading rhetoric, the use of any other tactics to shape the viewer's perspective on the news. And then that'll be your last homework assignment. And then after that, it's just the final exam. So you're going to pay attention to these Chapter 9 notes, because that's stuff that I can ask you about on the final. And, you'll do your last homework, and then that's the end of the semester. So, okay, guys, if everything sounds clear and good, let's go ahead and start talking about this last chapter of the book that we are going to review. That's Chapter 9. So we've covered a lot of topics so far, all semester long, in logic and critical thinking. We started by just going over the whole concept of argumentation, and we learned some basic fundamental concepts of logic, like what is an argument, what is deduction, what is induction, what is a deductively valid argument, what is a sound argument, what's an inductively strong argument. What are the different forms of deductively valid arguments, like modus ponens, modus tollens, chain argument, okay? After that, we talked about, qualities that good critical thinkers have. We talked about the importance of these famous social psychology experiments in terms of thinking about what it is to be a good critical thinker. What are some of the obstacles to being a good critical thinker? What are some of the benefits that you get from it? And so forth. So that was Chapter 3. Chapter 1. Chapter 3 then was all about language and communication. We talked about the definition of language, different functions of language, different types of definitions, qualities of a good definition, criteria for a good definition, rhetorical devices, and different communication styles. Then we talked about knowledge. That was Chapter 4. So we just, the definition of knowledge, justified true belief. What are some different primary sources of evidence? What are some reliable sources of justification or evidence? What are some unreliable ones, like hearsay or anecdote? And then we just talked about what are some of the cognitive and perceptual errors that block us from getting knowledge, how to evaluate the testimony of experts, the CRAP test for evaluating evidence, and all of that, okay? So then Chapter 5 was fallacies, which we've spent a good amount of time on. What are the different type of mistakes that people commit when they make arguments, logical errors or flaws? So we, talked about those, showed how they can also be seen in sometimes media and advertising and just marketing. And then just now we've discussed science, the history of science, what the basic definition of it is, what are some assumptions of it, and limitations that it has, and what are qualities of a good scientific theory. Also, what is a scientific method? We discussed some famous figures from early science. So that's just me summarizing for you all the ground that we've covered. But now we come to the end of the course and one more subject for us, and that is ethics. So Chapter 9 is all about ethics. So I want to get the meeting started just by having a kind of open conversation with you, touch base with you, see where your head is at when you think of a word like the word ethics. So once I see what you think of the word, what your understanding of it is. Then I'll develop it a little further and give you some notes to think about. So, ethics. Maybe this is a word you've heard sometime in your life. Probably you have, because it's not exactly a most uncommon word, even though maybe it's not always at the top of your vocabulary, but still, ethics. Who has a sense of the meaning of the term? What is ethics about? Just don't have to be too precise, but even if you have a vague idea, something like just a stab at it, what do you think ethics pertains to? Someone's behavior. Okay, good, Caitlin. Correct. And Larissa, you add morality. Hannah, you say ideas that you follow and live by. Okay, these are all good things to get the discussion started. Moral principles. That's a very good comment, Ashley. So these are all in the ballpark of being correct. I want to kind of maybe focus on some of those suggestions there. Larissa and Ashley, you've got, I think, a pretty good intuition about what this word is all about. So yeah, ethics is about morality. In philosophy, when we consider questions about right and wrong, good and bad, what people should do or should not do, what's morally right or wrong, when we think of those types of topics and questions, we are now engaged in ethics. So ethics is just the study of morality and moral concepts. So that's the main emphasis of talking about ethics. It's talking about the concept of morality. So I wanted to kind of even drill down a little bit even further here. We've said ethics is about the study of morality and moral concepts. For example, what is a pair of words or ideas that are about morality, but they sort of are like opposites? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, can you think of like a pair of terms where one of them expresses like one side of morality, and then the other one is kind of the opposite? What's a sort of set of words that come to your mind when I mention that? So like talking about morality, you've got the distinction between blank and blank on two different sides of the moral divide. What do you think could be my reference here? Good and bad? Okay, very good, Larissa. Yeah, like good as opposed to bad, morally good and bad. So let me, and Hannah, that's another good one. So I just kind of want to list some moral concepts underneath this here definition of ethics. And I'll just put it on a dividing line. So there's like, well, I don't need the cross actually. So just on the left here, we've got like right versus wrong. Okay, and I see you writing good and bad. Very good. That's also another pair of like opposite ethical distinctions. Sometimes when a person does something, we look at that behavior and we say, you know what, good on them. They did something really good. That was good. That was right. And maybe we praise the person, you know, for doing the right thing or the good thing. On the other hand, sometimes we look at either individual behavior or, you know, even just the behavior of groups, and we say, no, that was bad. That was, sorry, what am I writing the word pair for? Thank you. I'm just, you know, I was thinking of the word pair as I wrote it. Please forgive me for the mistaken note. It should say bad. Pair of terms, right? Good and bad. But anyway, that can sometimes happen. It just shows you that we can all make cognitive errors, right? But back to what I was saying. Good and bad, yeah. So sometimes we look at a person's behavior and we say, oh, that was bad. They should never have done that. That was wrong. That was a wrong thing to do. They did it. They shouldn't have done it, though. It was wrong. So we have got good and bad, right and wrong. Let's add to the list. Can we put another thing up there? So you say steal from the rich and give to the poor. Very high-level question, Sebastian. Yes. That's a perhaps complex moral question. And we will get into moral theories by the time this whole chapter is finished. You'll find out that there are different answers to your question. It depends on the theory of morality that a person accepts. So to some people, this is I'm just previewing for you discussions that we will have in more depth later. But some people hold the view that whatever creates the most happiness is the right thing to do. So if that's the viewpoint, Sebastian, then some of those type of people might say, yeah, it's actually good when you steal from the rich and give to the poor, because if the rich person, if the loss of their happiness is overweighed by the gain of happiness to the poor person, then that's a net gain of, more utility. So you should do that. But then there are other, viewpoints according to which it's always wrong to steal, no matter how much positive consequences come from doing it for anybody. So some people would say there's just a moral rule that says you should never steal, and it's wrong to steal. Other people would say, it depends. It depends on the case. Does the act of theft produce more benefit than harm? So it's kind of debated, Sebastian. But I think most people have the viewpoint that, yeah, theft is wrong, generally speaking, with few exceptions. So I couldn't tell you categorically, here's the universally accepted answer, whether it's always a wrong thing or whether there are exceptions. It does sort of depend on the detail of how a person accepts a different theory of ethics. Okay, but that's a good question, because what you've asked shows that you're thinking critically already. Like, we've received these definitions, but how can they really be applied to real world behavior? Sometimes one action one person may say is wrong. Another person may disagree and say, I don't think so. I think that was actually the right thing to do. So definitely there's room for argument and rational disagreement on some of these ethical questions, yes. I wanted to add a few more things, though, because I'm sure there's a little bit more we could provide on this list. So in the same kind of genre here, right versus wrong, good versus bad, can you think of another couple of perhaps pairs of terms where one of them expresses like the positive moral status and the other expresses the opposite? So it's not just good, bad, right, and wrong, but there's also, you'll tell me now, blank versus blank. What's another one that kind of has the same vibe as these? Anybody? I can throw a few more out there, but I think you may be able to do it too. Moral terms that seem to be like binary opposites. Good and bad, right and wrong, that's two of them. That's probably the two big ones for sure, but maybe one at least more, or two more. Just and unjust, that's good, yeah, thanks. So that's another one that is often described. Just versus unjust. Sometimes we look at an act and we say that was a just and righteous thing that happened. That it was justice that was done. In other cases, we look at some action and we say that was really unjust. That was an injustice. And so that strikes against the person's sense of, moral right or wrong. There's just, there's unjust, good and bad, right and wrong. Let me see if I can sort of get you to figure out the other half of this. Moral versus what? What's the opposite of moral? Celine, you say devil and angel. Yes, but I don't want to presuppose any particular religious affiliation. Some people don't even believe in the existence of God or the devil, but morality is something that everyone can talk about. So moral versus immoral is another one. Right, wrong, good, bad, just, unjust, moral versus immoral. And I'll just leave one more up there. Since it's all about not just the status of the action, but how you should behave, we could also put in like how a person ought to act versus how a person ought to not act. Okay, so we just have here a quick little brief listing of some, that's another one, good, Hannah, yeah, ethical and unethical. I can sort of maybe squeeze that in up here. Ethical versus unethical. Okay, and I mean, the list does go on. We could probably add more. You say nice versus mean. Yeah, Natalie, so as a temperament of a person's character, we prefer someone to be nice and kind, than to be mean and offensive and rude. So, I mean, I'm not going to say that that's incorrect. No, that certainly fits into the same kind of list. But now that we've run out of some space, I'm just going to leave it at that. So whenever we distinguish between judging an action on either of those ways, when we look at behavior and we say of it that it was wrong or that it was right, it was unjust, no, it was just. Any such designation that we make is thinking about ethics. Sometimes we're the subject of other people's moral judgment or even our own, so like sometimes you do things which are subject to moral evaluation, and other people sometimes will look at you and say, why did you do that? That was wrong. That was not right. And sometimes you're the subject of praise. That was a really tough thing and you did the right thing, and congratulations for you to doing the right thing. So sometimes we're the subject of praise or blame, depending on whether we are judged to have acted on one of these two different principles or bases. And sometimes, of course, we are the moral judge. And it's not just individuals who engage in moral judgment, but it's whole societies too. I mean, when we establish laws, we think that these laws reflect our generally shared sense of right and wrong. That's why we say it's a crime for you to do certain things that we think are wrong actions. And on the other hand, there are things that you're given liberty to do because we think that there's nothing wrong with doing those. So human beings, among all of the animals that exist, have a very highly developed sense of right and wrong. We hold people accountable to their moral transgressions. And that's something that, if you look back throughout history and if you look at religion or anything else, is very deeply rooted in the whole human condition. So it's something that's worthy of exploration and investigation, just like anything else of significance to the human condition that we are in. So that's why it's also in our book. Now, sometimes when well, let me add one more piece of definition. So I'm going to clear the top part of the board. And I want to mention this word, which is referred to in the book, and it is moral reasoning. Okay, so moral reasoning is just when you're a person who makes a decision, a judgment about the moral status of some action. So the definition given is when you make a decision about what is right or wrong, or about what you should or should not do. Say should or should not, I don't mean in the practical sense, I mean in the moral sense. So I probably should say, to be honest, I don't like the word ought or ought not here. Ought, the word embodies a more moral sense than just should. Okay, so moral reasoning. When you're the person making a decision about what is right or wrong, or about what you should or shouldn't do, or what you ought or ought not to do, you're now engaging in moral reasoning. So sometimes we just reason about what's true or false. We look at arguments, we look at evidence, and we see if we have good enough reasons to believe a conclusion. And that's something we studied throughout the whole course. Sometimes, though, the thing that we're considering is whether some action or some kind of conduct is right or wrong morally. And so when you sit back and you question and decide whether you think something's right or wrong, that's moral reasoning right there. And there's all kinds of things that this happens about, just to point out a few big moral debates in society. Some people believe that abortion is immoral, right? There's the pro-life movement. There's also the pro-choice movement that says restricting access to abortion is wrong. So these are two different perspectives which have different judgment, different moral reasoning about the case of abortion, whether it's right or wrong. Sometimes it's your own behavior that you make a moral judgment about. That's when you reason over what you ought or ought not to do. Suppose there's a student who has difficulty with a class and they're thinking about turning in a plagiarized paper or something. They may be reasoning then at that moment, well, should I do this or not? Would it be wrong to do it or not wrong? So when we make judgments about how we ought to behave morally, or when we just make determinations about what is right or wrong in general, we're now morally reasoning. Moral decisions, big and small, they face us all the time throughout our lives, right? Should I do this action? Should I not do it? What causes should I be supportive of? Which ones should I oppose? Where shall I lend my voice in giving advocacy for various positions or even political platforms or legislative arguments. So sometimes when we engage in moral reasoning, it's unconscious to us too. Sometimes we just have like a feeling that something's wrong. We have a deep-seated feeling about it, but we are sometimes unaware of the factors or reasons why we have that reaction. So it's not like every time you engage in moral reasoning, you actually have a clear moment where you're saying, let me judge why it's right or wrong and weigh all the factors pro and con. Oftentimes, it's a subconscious reasoning process, and you just sort of experience the feeling that something is either good or bad, right or wrong. But what we want to do in this semester, well, in this part of the semester, is to make the process of moral reasoning a little bit more self-aware, a little bit more something that you explicitly undertake, so that you don't just sort of do it unconsciously or without attention to the reasoning. So by learning a little bit more about the study of ethics and philosophy, we will become more sharp moral reasoners. There's actually even some evidence to indicate that people who are better at reasoning just in general, you know, evaluating the evidence for a conclusion, are also better at moral reasoning too. So there's like some spillover between coming up with good moral judgment and just having good judgment, period. So next thing I want to do is mention to you guys what are three major categories of moral action. In ethics, it is said that there are three major types of action, three ethical categories of action. So I'm going to put them all here and we'll just discuss that for a bit. So three main types of action in ethics. Okay, so the first one, sorry, I'm just trying to get like a better marker here. So one type of action in ethics are actions that are classified as morally impermissible. On the flip side of that, sort of the opposite, is actions that are morally permissible. And then a third category, even beyond being morally permitted, there's the case of actions that are deemed morally obligatory. Okay, now, I've just written the terms here, but I haven't yet written the definitions. That's because I was hoping to see if I could stimulate you to even come up with a guess even as to what the definition could be. And I don't think that'd be that hard, because just knowing English and having a basic knowledge of what these words mean in their ordinary use, I think you can put them together and come up with the right definition. So, morally impermissible. What do you think that could mean in other words? If an action is deemed to be morally impermissible, what do you think that means about that action? A morally impermissible act is what kind of act? In another way of saying it. Not allowed. Okay, good. Something that's wrong. Exactly. That's perfect. So morally impermissible actions are actions that are morally wrong. And to be maybe less formal about it, they're just things that are not okay to do. People may do them, and sadly, people do them, but they shouldn't be doing them. They're morally wrong things to do. They're not physically impossible, but they're morally impermissible. Okay, so those are acts that are wrong. And you know, that means they're not okay to do, morally speaking. Not okay to do. Okay, so before I move on to the next example, yes, Gabriel, that's right, something that is seen as not okay to be done. Before I move to the morally permissible category, I want to spend a moment longer on this, because I'm asking you now to think of what could be examples. I bet you can come up with some pretty clear examples that no one will disagree about as to what could be some specific kinds of actions that are in this column, morally impermissible actions. What do you think? You know, if I'm pressing you to tell me, well, what is an example of a morally impermissible action? You see the definition. So that includes, okay, murder, just going straight up to the top. Yes, certainly. Murder, killing of a person without cause, is wrong. It's not okay to do. It's something that's morally wrong. That's probably one of the worst things that a person can do morally. So there's definitely a scale of intensity. And that's probably far along on the really, really bad side of the spectrum. But sure, that's one case. Clarissa, you say drinking and driving. Yeah. The person who drinks and drives is being reckless with the health and safety of other people and even themselves and any passengers, if such there be in the car. So by doing that, they're taking unnecessary risks with health and life and public safety. So it's an irresponsible and negligent, reckless thing to do. Even if people do it, it's a wrong action. It's not okay. So I see also rape. Yes, a very, very bad action that people sometimes unfortunately commit to, you know, take a sexual act against somebody against their permission without their willing consent is treating them like they're just a mere object with no ability to control their body. And that's one of the most, you know, evil things you can do. It's a big violation of morality. So that's wrong, yes. Arson, correct, I would say. Sure, setting fire to lands or property just to cause chaos and mayhem. There's no good reason for that. And of course, that's wrong and it's not okay. I see Mateo says tax fraud and robbery, stealing. These are all listed. These are all good examples. So you guys seem to have, I think, no problem understanding that. But let me mention this. Some things that are morally impermissible are not quite as consequential as some of these mentioned acts, like killing, robbery, theft, rape, you know. And there's also things that are even worse than those, okay? We could go for like genocide, torture, you know, I don't even know. There's so many horrible things that unfortunately can and have happened. But even if we go back on the valence of how bad things could be and how impermissible they could be, some things are just wrong, but they don't have much of an impact. Like, for example, if I make a promise to you to give you a ride from the airport, so you need a ride, I'm your friend, you say, I don't know, I don't have the money or time to get a lift, so could you give me a ride? And I say, sure, I'll do that. When do you need me to be there? And I promise I'll be there. So you say, 12:30 in the afternoon on the Saturday of the week. So I'm like, okay, 12:30 on Saturday, I'll be there. You have my word, I promise. I put it on everything. I put it on, you know, I swear, I'll be there. You have my word. And now, suppose that 12:30 passes, the guy's at the airport waiting for you. He's like, is he running late? They give you a call. And they're like, hello, what's up? I'm just making sure you're still coming like you said, because I'm here. And you say, yeah, I know you're there, but I'm not coming, and I never was going to come. This is a big hoax, and I'm playing a joke on you. I wanted you to get stranded at the airport. Good luck finding your way back. You really trusted me. You're such a loser. You know, I'm laughing at you. You hang up on the person. Now, did you do something wrong? Yeah, that's wrong. But I guess it's not something that, you know, you can't be punished as a crime, and it's not perhaps the end of the world, but it's wrong. You know, when you make a promise, morally speaking, you're supposed to keep a promise. So the violation of a promise, like, I don't know, cheating on a person that you're married to when you took vows, these are also probably things that we could list in the same category, but maybe they're certainly not as bad as killing people, right? And Natalie, you say the lying. It does depend on the nature of the lie, right? So I just mentioned imagine a person's had an affair with a whole other person and they're in committed marriage. They're lying about the existence of the affair to their partner. And I mean, that could be pretty harmful and destructive to the family, to their sense of commitment. And lying can take any number of different forms. But sometimes it's a little white lie that we don't think has too much harm behind it. Like someone asks you, do you like this meal that I cooked? I really worked hard on it and you did not like it. But you're going to tell them otherwise because you just don't want them to have their feelings hurt. So yes, good discussion. So anyway, I want to move on though to the next category, morally permissible. Okay, so we've already covered the first, morally impermissible. It's just stuff that's wrong, morally wrong, and it's not okay for you to do it. So then what do you think would be morally permissible? It's sort of the reverse. So how would you define that? If morally impermissible are the wrong things that are not okay to do, then what are the morally permissible things by definition, you think? Let me see what your guess would be here. Acts that are okay to do. Okay, very good, Larissa. Yeah, so these are actions that are not wrong. They're not wrong, and they are okay for you to do. Okay, so I'll just put that here. Okay, so morally permissible actions are not wrong, and they are okay to do. Now I would like to do the same thing we just did, where I asked you what could be some examples. And let me just preface that by saying this. I bet you're going to have no problem finding examples of this one, because it seems like we got a really good moral group here in this class. And if that's the case, then I would suppose almost 100% of your daily activity is right there, right? Because you just don't do much wrong stuff. So maybe you can take examples from your own life or from just others. Joshua, you're saying jaywalk. Okay, that's a very good mention, but I don't know. I think I understand the subtlety you're trying to provide to our conversation. You're basically saying it's considered illegal, but it might not be harmful, especially if the road is wide open, and therefore, morally speaking, whether it's legal or illegal, morally it's not really wrong. I feel you, I would agree, but I don't want to confuse the students too much. I want to talk about the difference between law and morality in just a minute. Now, Larissa, you say driving while sick? I'm a little confused. Do you mean, well, that's an interesting case. I guess it's morally permissible to drive while sick, you know, you're alone. I mean, you're able to use the car, so there's no problem with that. Doing someone a favor, sure, Eric, unless the favor is like to kill their, you know, wife or husband or something. But yeah, you know, exceptional cases aside, a basic favor, no problem with that. Feeding the homeless, yes, no problem there either. Donating, helping someone cross the street, giving to the poor. These are all great examples. Volunteering at a nonprofit organization, yeah, doing a blood donation, working at the food bank, at the homeless shelter, writing someone a nice letter, giving an offering to the church. There's a lot of stuff that's morally permissible. But Joshua, you know, you did have a good idea, and I want to return to that. So we'll hold your thought for just a moment. So a lot of the stuff that you guys have mentioned as the morally permissible acts, hey, good, Brittany, I was just going to say that. So hold your thought too. A lot of the things you guys have mentioned here, they seem like very noble acts. They are like righteous things where you're actually helping other people. You're doing something to provide benefit to another person, like feeding the homeless, helping someone cross the street. That is also a good mention. Those are all morally permissible actions. But kind of in line with what you've said, Brittany, and even to a lesser extent, but also related, Joshua, even just actions that don't seem to have any particular importance or that don't necessarily conduce to anyone's improvement or, you know, whatever, they can be morally permissible as well. As long as they just don't violate morality or harm anybody, then they're also morally permissible acts. So let me give you some weird examples, right? If I choose tonight, yeah, like doing the dishes, it's a good example, Lena. I actually have some dishes that I still need to do right now in my kitchen. If I do those dishes, is that okay? Is that not wrong? Sure, that's not wrong. It's not like it's necessarily saving the world or creating a cure to cancer or, you know, helping a person in need, but it's a basic household chore, and if I do it, no one can come to me and be like, shame on you. What are you doing? Stop that. That is wrong. So there's no basis for moral blame to me if I do such a thing. I was going to give a weirder example, also ironically involving the kitchen, so maybe we're on the same wavelength right now, Lena, but if I wanted tonight to change things up and instead of sleeping in the bedroom on the bed, I want to roll out a sleeping bag in the kitchen in my own, you know, house and sleep there. Is that morally permissible for me to just try to sleep in the kitchen tonight? Is it morally permissible? What do you think? It's just your moral reasoning. I would say same. Yeah, Brittany, it's morally permissible, but does it really benefit anybody? No, and it doesn't even really benefit me because it'd probably be uncomfortable. But the point is, it's my house. I could do something odd and unconventional in there. That's not a harm to anybody else, and it doesn't strike against anybody else's interests. So even though it's a perhaps strange choice to make, you can't say that it's immoral. So morally permissible acts include all the things that are really, really good and they're beneficial, but also the little daily things that you were mentioning, Brittany, which just don't relate to any kind of harm or violation. So if I want to walk around down the street in a chicken suit, that's not normal, and it'd be kind of perhaps an odd-fashioned choice, but it's not necessarily evil either. It's not an immoral act. It's just a weird thing to do. Okay? So let's go on then, and we got one more. Morally obligatory. So based on the wording, maybe you have a sense of this. if it's morally obligatory, it's like it's even going beyond just saying it's morally permitted. So what do you think that would refer to then? Morally obligatory actions are what, you think? They're, in other words, actions that what? Actions that, yes, Eric, that you have to do, that you must do, morally speaking. The word obligation is built into it. So these are moral, not just permission, but obligation. You must do it, and it would actually be wrong, not okay, to not do it. Okay, so correct. Acts that you must do, and it is wrong or not okay not to do. Okay, so this perhaps takes a moment longer to think of examples, but maybe you got some that you can give me. What do you think could be fairly viewed as a morally obligatory action? So an action that you're supposed to do it, you must do it. If you didn't do it, that would be wrong. So these are things that you may do. You may do, but these are things that you must do. So these are sort of optional, but these are mandatory. Paying bills, taxes. Okay, so let me go into both of those. First of all, for taxes, Kelly, yes, I mean, we have to have a funding mechanism for all of our public programs and for our national defense. So clearly that has to be revenue that is drawn from the taxpayers. Therefore, you might argue there is a moral obligation to pay your taxes because you receive the benefits of the state in terms of being provided police, firefighters, public highways, schools, and so forth. But, you know, I always have to kind of play devil's advocate because as a philosopher, that's part of the game. I try to find some type of counterexample. So, of course, as you may know, there are people who are like, that have like righteous opposition to taxation. There are some people that believe in libertarianism who say that the government maybe shouldn't even exist or it should be very small and limited. And so some people believe that taxation is like equivalent to taking my money, spending it on projects that I may not fully value. I don't believe in that view at all. But of course, since that view exists, there could be some debate as to the topic of whether taxation and paying it is morally obligatory. But at least from my point of view, yeah, I would agree. Mateo, you say paying bills. I think that is a perhaps even clearer in my mind example, because when you pay a bill, it's for a service that you've already received. You know, so like if I go to the restaurant, right, and I order food and I eat the food, do you think I have a moral obligation, or am I just permitted to pay the bill at the end? I would say it's a moral obligation, right? It's wrong if I don't pay, and I must pay, because if I fail to pay, I am doing something wrong by non-payment. Right. So it's for services and goods rendered unto you, the payment of it is required because you're not permitted to steal. CPR, I don't know, Miguel. I guess suppose if you know how to do CPR and a person is in need of the process, you know, of CPR, surely it would be a good thing for you to do. But some people are not on the same page that you have an obligation to assist. That's a debated point. Some people think that you're just obligated not to harm, but to actually render assistance is something that you're at liberty to withhold on because, you know, your liberty rights entail that you may remain uninvolved in a chaotic or dangerous situation. But I do believe that most people should feel the moral obligation there. What about tipping the waiter, Edward? Well, that has to do, I guess, with the cultural norm of the society you live in, because, you know, in a lot of places, like in Europe, there's less emphasis on tipping because the workers are just more adequately compensated for their work and their hourly wage. But of course, yeah, here in America, where we do have a tipping culture, I think if you fail to tip is a breach of a very reasonable expectation that the vendor has for you. So, I mean, it's perhaps not exactly black and white, but I would say, yeah, you have a moral obligation to tip. And you should probably be a generous tipper too, but that's perhaps further subtlety. Yeah, and it's true, Mateo, there are some cultures in which it's regarded as like, I don't know, trying to curry favor or be disrespectful to the generosity of their employer. So there's differences of cultural opinion on that. Going to K through 12 school, Larissa, surely it's somewhat a legal obligation, and, you know, if you fail to attend for those years, it's called being truant, and, you know, you can be disciplined for that. But but I don't know. There could be people out there who believe that the schooling system is somehow miseducating their children, and they wish instead to have their kids in a private or homeschool environment. But yeah, in general, I don't have any disagreement with that. Obeying traffic laws, like stopping at a red light. Well, Jamie, that is a legal obligation, but is it really a moral obligation? This kind of goes back to the thing that Joshua had said earlier. If I jaywalk, or if I run the stop sign, doesn't it somewhat depend on whether or not that has the potential to harm anybody? I mean, you could argue that the law is there because if nobody respected the rule, then it would be pure chaos. But if an occasional person did it, like in the middle of the night when it's obvious that no one's around, then you might say, well, that has no real harmful consequence. And even though it's technically a violation of law, it's not really doing something that is considered wrong on a moral basis. Like if someone sees you crossing the street in the dead of night where there's no one around for like miles, it'd be weird for them to say, hey, that is evil, that's wrong, stop it, shame on you. But anyway, I understand your point. Okay, so morally obligatory acts, things that you must do and they're wrong not to do. Someone up there also said taking care of your child, right? Well, given that you have accepted custody of the child, you haven't given the child off for adoption or anything, then yes, the parent, I would say, has a moral obligation. They're not just permitted to care for their child, pay for their upkeep, feed them, and house them. That's an obligation that they've taken on because they wanted to keep this child. So a lot of things could be placed in this third category. The keeping of a promise is yet another case. I mentioned the example before of like a promise to pick someone up at the airport. When you make the promise, you don't create, let's say, necessarily a legal obligation because it's not enforceable like a contract if you fail to live up to that promise. Just a personal, informal agreement between two people, a spoken agreement. So it's not legally binding, but it's morally obligatory, right? If you don't want to have to do something, then you should not, what? You should not promise to do it. Because promising doesn't say, maybe I'll help you do it if I feel like it. It says, no, I give you my word and I guarantee that I'll do it because I'm promising. So the violation of promises, etc., could be another case of something that's you're obligated to not do. I want to mention here at this point, there's a logical correlation or, I don't know, connection between this definition and this one. And here's why. Not doing what is morally impermissible. So avoiding the morally impermissible action is morally obligatory. Okay? And not doing what is morally obligatory is impermissible. So the non-performance of your obligations is wrong, and not doing what is wrong is an obligation. So for anything that is morally impermissible, like murder, for example, that you guys mentioned earlier, yeah, I will do that in a moment, Brittany, but to the point here, any action that is morally impermissible, like say for the case of discussion, murder is morally impermissible, so that means logically that you have a moral obligation to what? Can you finish that statement? If it is morally impermissible to murder, then you are morally obligated to what? To not kill, right? Okay, good. So if it's impermissible to lie, then you're obligated to not lie. And if you're obligated to keep a promise, then it's impermissible not to do that. If it's morally obligatory for you to pay the bill when you've eaten the food already, then it's impermissible not to. Okay, so just understand that the negation of this is an obligation, and the negation of an obligation is wrong. Now, Brittany, another example of morally obligatory action. So I said the keeping of a promise, the adhering to a contract, the provision of payment for services rendered. There could also be the duty to assist. Perhaps some would argue duty to assist when you can do it at no cost to yourself. Like if you were, say, walking past a pond and you saw a little child drowning in the pond because they can't really swim, and all you really have to do to save their life is lean over for a moment, give them your hand, and pull them up out. You could argue that that is so easy for you to prevent their death that you are morally obligated to intervene and prevent it. So Brittany, do these examples kind of click or resonate with you? They're just a requirement not to do things that are impermissible or a requirement to do things that are obligatory. You have a moral obligation to not kill, to not steal, to not lie, And maybe you have a moral obligation to do certain things also, like to pay a bill, to render assistance, to at least not commit fraud or rape or any other number of actions. Okay, so good. Here's the next thing I wanted to go into, and it's about the difference between law and morality. Now, a lot of times people, before they study ethics, right, they just have this everyday idea in their mind that what's wrong is just whatever is illegal under the law, and what's right is whatever the law permits. But this is really not correct, and I'll tell you why. Because if that was true, then that would mean that morality is just equal to the law, so that nothing that was illegal could ever be okay to do, and that nothing that was ever legal could ever be wrong to do. But that is simply just not true. Using your moral reasoning right now, can you tell me of something that has been considered legal, at least at some time in history, but even when it was legal, it was just a wrong thing morally? Can you think of anything that was legally tolerated or allowed, but wrong nonetheless? Okay, Gabriel, slavery, yes. For sure, that's the example I kind of had in mind, but we could talk about other things too. Nonetheless, let's just focus on slavery for a minute. The owning of another human being as though they're property for you, that's then going to do labor with no compensation, selling people off, splitting up families like as if these were just dogs and cats that you could adopt in order to enslave. I mean, nothing could be considered, I think, more a violation of basic human dignity. But of course, the law in the United States and in other countries for a long time, at least here until the Civil War, right, was that it was legal to own a slave. And in fact, at that time, you could have been prosecuted for freeing a slave, like Harriet Tubman did in the Underground Railroad. But do we look back at those time periods and say the violator of the slave law was doing an immoral act? No. We think that they were righteous, that they were being disobedient to an unjust law. So we can only make moral criticism of the law if we think that the law and morality are not necessarily the same thing. I've seen other examples you guys have written here. Not allowing women to vote, correct. Do you know that it's been 100 years only in the United States since women were given the right to vote by the 20th Amendment? In 1920, the women's suffrage movement culminated in the change in our Constitution. But that took a while, right? From the founding of the country back in 1776 till 1920, women were not given any voice in terms of elections. Now, you could argue, and I would agree, that that was a wrong and an unjust status quo, but it was legally enshrined. So we can't just take the narrow view that anything that's a crime under the law is necessarily immoral, and that everything which is approved of in the law, or even obligated under the law, is necessarily good and right. In Nazi Germany, for example, if you had given safe harbor to a Jewish person like Anne Frank in the Anne Frank house, you could have been held accountable under the violation of their Nazi laws for doing that. But certainly people who resisted Nazism were not bad people doing wrong actions. Even now in this current day, right, some people anyway, think that the drug laws that we have are themselves bad. You know, some people say that they result in over-prosecution, targeting of minority communities, and the prison population, we have mass incarceration that needs to be addressed. Some people will say that a person taking recreational drugs, like marijuana, for example, which is the most prevalent case of a drug that leads to incarceration, even though it's one of the least harmful scientifically, some people will say this is a bad law, and if I use that drug, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm violating the law, but I'm not doing anything immoral. So sometimes people believe that actions which are criminalized are not actually immoral. And on the other hand, actions that are legalized are not necessarily wrong to everybody. Not necessarily right to everybody, thanks. Another case, is zooming around to different examples, abortion, right? In our constitutional framework, since 1972, the Roe versus Wade decision of the Supreme Court has held that we have a constitutionally protected right to have a physician-assisted abortion in a safe medical environment. And that's been upheld numerous times since 1972. Of course, now we have a new composition of the Supreme Court, and if these cases reach that court again, there are definitely real, concerns, perhaps, about whether or not the law, whether or not the principle will be upheld again. But anyway, as of today, and for almost 50 years going back, that's been the judgment of the courts, and that's been the law of the land. Of course, though, there are a lot of people who believe passionately that abortion is immoral, despite the fact that it's legal. So I'm just referring you to a very basic point, that when we think about morality, we're thinking about something that's actually even deeper than law. I want you to think of morality in the following sense. I want you to think about it as though you're the legislator who creates the law or who votes on it. Now, when you're up there in Congress, right, and you have to make decisions about what the law should be, then you can't just defer to a higher court of authority and say, how can I vote on this bill? Oh, I'm going to vote on the bill depending on what the law tells me to do. Because no, you're the law maker, not just the subject to it. So when you think about morality, you need to think about it as the legislator of the moral law rather than subject to it. So instead of just saying, here's something that's a crime, and so that means it's wrong, you have to think originally independently on your own. Like, should it be penalized according to my moral perspective or not? Now, I don't want you to take this too far in the opposite extreme either, though. I don't want you to think that law and morality have nothing to do with each other and law is never coinciding with what's right and wrong. For the most part, I would say that our body of law does reflect our shared sense of right and wrong. And we use the laws and the penalties that exist in them to hold people accountable to our shared standards of morality. But the legislator who votes on what laws to approve or to disapprove has to use their own independent moral judgment to determine whether they think it would be good or bad for that law to be put into effect. Okay, so we don't judge morality by looking at common law. We judge common law and whether or not these are good or bad laws by reflecting on our deep sense of right and wrong. Okay, so just understand, sometimes in history there have been laws that protect bad things, and sometimes there have been laws that criminalize good things. Not necessarily all the time, and we hope that that's the minority of examples, but it's possible. So I don't want anyone to come away from this being like, well, I already know what's right and wrong. Just look up the penal code and it just tells me, and all I have to do is follow the law. You should follow the law for the most part, but you should also understand that there's the possibility for unjust laws. And if that wasn't so, then there would be no legitimate basis for civil disobedience, for people to get out there and protest and say, hey, we disagree with these laws and we demand that they be changed. But of course, peaceful protest is a hallmark of, democratic form of civilization and government. So to the extent that we believe it's valid and proper for people to be able to go out and peacefully state that they disagree with some established law, that means that there's always going to be the ability to have a moral perspective that is critical of some current day law. Okay, so 3 main types of action in ethics: morally impermissible, permissible, and obligatory. So I guess the next thing I want to talk to you guys about in the textbook, which is mentioned in chapter 9, are about the moral versus non-moral values. Okay, so the textbook mentions these 2 kinds of values: moral values and non-moral values. So let's go over that. Okay, so moral values are values that benefit you and other people. And they're also considered good for their own sake. All right, so okay, so they benefit you and other people, and they're considered good for their own sake. And I'll give you some examples of these moral values here. So example given, things like altruism, justice, forgiveness, like, for example, compassion. Okay, so those are moral values, and let me just give a more in-depth description now. Moral values, as you can see the definition, are values that are beneficial, but they're beneficial not just to the individual, they're also beneficial to other people with whom you interact. So they're good for everybody, they're good for you, but also other people. And then the last part is that they're also considered good for their own sake. These values, when they're exhibited, when they're displayed in your behavior, in your actions, they are considered good things, even if they don't necessarily lead to any kind of productive results. So, as an example, forgiveness. If you, sorry, sometimes you get some caught in your throat while you're talking, right? Okay, so forgiveness. If you hold the forgiveness as a value, can voting be an example? Well, voting is an action rather than a value. So I understand kind of your point that it's good for you and for other people and it's good in its own sake, but just the category I think is a little off, because to vote is an action. There are values that you hold that may lead you to vote. Like, for example, you value equality or something, or you value justice, and so you want to add your voice to the electoral outcome. And by means of that value, you take an action that's inspired by the value. Okay, so but actions are different from the values that lead to the actions. So that's what I would say there, Clarissa, if that makes sense. But like, okay, I was just saying forgiveness. If you hold a value of forgiveness, right, and that's something that you care about, that's a value of yours, then when there's a time where you've been wronged or treated badly by somebody, that value it's going to show itself, because you're going to forgive the person. Now, when you forgive other people, it's good for them, because now they can restore a happy and friendly mutual relationship with you without like a grudge, without harboring ill will or bad feelings towards them. Okay, so it allows people to restore friendly relations with each other. So it's good for the other person who has shown forgiveness. It's better off for them than if you just rejected them and shunned them forever. But also it's a benefit to you, because what's the alternative to forgiving somebody? That you just continue to stew in your, upset feelings and, whatever hatred or just ill will towards the person. If you hang on to those feelings of resentment, then that actually is a burden that you have to carry. So you're better off lightening the psychological burden that you have by being a little just more forgiving and tolerant of people. And that's also something that benefits them. But hold on, okay? Suppose, is this possible? Could it possibly happen that you forgive somebody, and even though you did that, they still betrayed you again? Is it possible for forgiveness to not work out to your advantage? Can that ever happen? What do you think? Maybe you have an experience like that. Is it possible for forgiveness to not necessarily result in the other person behaving better? Can that happen? I just wonder if you have a thought about that. I mean, I'm not trying to trick you. I think it's an easy question. You think you can forgive someone and not invite them back in your life? Right, true, Natalie. Not to worry, I understand. Like, you can let go of the feeling of resentment and everything, but you don't necessarily want them to be back in your life. But I'm asking a slightly different question, right? Which is sort of on the same point, though. Can a person forgive and get stabbed in the back again? Surely that can happen, okay? And then Larissa, you say yes, your dad will forgive you and then still just use it as a way to lecture you instead of just moving on. Or that you forgive him and then blah, blah, blah. So, sure, sometimes forgiveness doesn't work out in your best interests. But here's the point that this last clause is making. Even if no good comes of it, in the sense of the person doesn't act better and the situation doesn't necessarily improve, even if that does happen sometimes, we still look at the person who had the tendency to forgive and say, you know what, though, that was a good thing. It's good that you're a forgiving person, even if sometimes the people who you show forgiveness towards don't honor it and don't change their ways. So that's what this means. These are values that are good. They're good for you. They're good for others. And even when they don't produce any kind of positive results, we still think they're good for their own sake, because it's just good by itself to be forgiving, even if sometimes the forgiving disposition doesn't lead to any advantages for you or for others. Normally, though, it does. But sometimes, even when it doesn't, we still honor and praise the person to have that quality. And it's the same with these other things, right? If you have a motive and a value of justice, that means when it's time for you to decide how to treat people, you're going to try and treat them fair and equally, okay? And give them what they deserve and not anything else. If you treat people fairly and you're just, then they've been treated fairly, and so that's good for them. It's also good for you because you can sleep well at night and you can, have the courage of your convictions that you're a good person who stands on the right principles. But also, look, if you treat someone with justice and you treat them fairly, but then they double cross you and they're unjust to you in return, still we look at the person who showed justice and we think, well, they were good for that. They were good for that reason. Even if other people behaved badly, the value that they displayed was a valuable, good thing in and of itself. Okay, so that's all. These are moral values. They're good for you, good for others, and they're considered good for their own sake. Compassion, the ability to kind of care about other people's struggles and take an interest in them. Altruism, feeling what other people feel and wanting the best for them. All of those things are moral values, and they're mentioned in the book. But on the other hand, there are non-moral values too, and that's important to know about. So non-moral values are goal-oriented values. So they're more self-interested. They're goal-oriented values, and they're considered only valuable as a means to an end. Okay, so goal-oriented values and only good as a means to an end. So in this category, there are such values as fame, popularity, wealth, prestige. Okay, so suppose that your action is motivated by you really value fame, or you really value being popular, or just being wealthy. Well, all of these values are instilled in a person because they're goal-oriented. A person wants to be popular because if they're popular, they think that that conduces to their good reputation and it gives them more opportunities, so they'll be happier that way. If a person wants fame, maybe they think that being famous is going to give them more recognition by other people, and then that will make them happy. Or that if they are wealthy, the wealth that they accumulate and obtain is going to give them more purchasing power for goods and services, and that freedom of purchasing power, financial security, that'll make them happy. But these are all about chasing after some kind of goal. Like, for example, people like to be famous, but not if it doesn't make them happy. People want to be popular, but not if that means that everyone's just going to gossip about them and talk bad behind their back. People want to be rich, but they don't want to be one of those rich people that ends up, I don't know, suicidally depressed. I mean, obviously we've seen that happen. Even famous celebrities sometimes have committed suicide. And so I guess in that case, wealth wasn't necessarily the thing that made them feel like their life was in a good place. So these are values, but they're only desired because you think that they're going to lead to some kind of happiness or pleasure for you. You don't want wealth necessarily for the sake of everyone else unless you also couple that with a moral value. And you don't necessarily want to be popular because of the benefit to others. It's for the benefit to you. So what the book mentions is that, all of us, we have a mixture of both kinds of values. At least most of us do, right? So we are motivated by our moral values, but also by our non-moral values. And the book just mentions that, and I think it's a fair comment, that you should be a little bit reflective. You should consider which kinds of values motivate your own everyday actions and behaviors. Like, for example, a consumer purchase. When you buy something, are you buying it because of a non-moral value or a moral value? When you form friendships, when you make decisions about what major you want to pursue or what relationships that you want to develop, what kind of moral or non-moral values are leading you to those actions. And they just advise that it's healthy and good for you to have a good dose of those moral values in your value system. Because if your only way of behaving or being motivated is according to the non-moral values, there are actually even scientific studies that show that that does have a tendency to lead to less personal happiness. So I don't know if it sounds like a cliche to you, but it's actually true. The people who have a little bit more of a moral example and moral fiber feel better about themselves, lead happier lives. It's not necessarily the happiest life. It's kind of a lonely life, being the pleasure-seeking, solipsistic, narcissistic type of person who doesn't care at all about the moral values. So do it if for no other reason than for yourself, because you're going to be psychologically healthier, happier, probably have better relationships with people too, if you have these moral values in place and if they inspire some of your behavior. That does not mean that you have to completely abandon your goal-oriented pursuits, but you should have their balanced off against some moral values too. Good critical thinkers are better moral reasoners. Non-moral values are shown not to necessarily control your ultimate happiness. Like wealth is a means by which you can obtain some happiness, but it's not the deepest and long-lasting, the kind that comes from like close bonds, loving and dear friends and other family members, being a good person who's made a positive contribution to the world. These are the things that seem to provide more long-lasting and abiding happiness. So there are even self-interested reasons to have some of these moral values, and that's mentioned here in the book. Okay, now after that, there's some discussion that follows about the conscience. So I just want to quickly refer to the conscience, and maybe that's all we'll have time for today. Then when we come back after the Thanksgiving holiday, we'll just continue and finish up the rest of chapter 9. So I just want to end with maybe one more term then, and that's the conscience. Okay, so the conscience is basically described as an innate source of knowledge about what is right or wrong. So the conscience. Don't confuse the word conscience with consciousness. Those are actually different words. Consciousness just refers to like even being able to see, taste, touch, hear, and smell, just being a conscious being, being able to feel and experience and having mental activity. But the conscience, instead of consciousness, the conscience is a moral concept. It's the idea of that little voice inside you, some people describe it that way, that kind of tells you, hey, you should or should not do that. Or sometimes your conscience causes you to look back at your previous behavior and your conscience bothers you because it tells you, you know, that was wrong, you really should not have done that. So you have a guilty conscience. Sometimes your conscience is clear. You're like, I have nothing to be guilty of. I have nothing to hide. I have a clear conscience because I know I've done the right thing for the right reasons. So your conscience, as the book describes it, and as I think common everyday discussions of it go, is this sort of internal, inner, innate, meaning that it's sort of born into you. As a human being, we already have kind of like some moral sense that's within us. And if we follow our conscience, it tries to lead us towards the right behavior and tries to steer us away from the wrong behavior. The book mentions that it seems like it's innate, but it's also something that can be either developed or left to wither away and not fully develop, depending on the way that your upbringing and experiences shape you. So it's kind of like language, right? We are human beings, and that means we can speak language. But even though we have the ability to discover and learn how to speak language, it has to be supported by the right kind of early childhood environmental conditions. So a baby, a normal, healthy baby born today, is not going to be speaking English like what we're speaking. But give them a few years with some parents and the community around them, and they're going to pick up words and they're going to start to talk like we all are doing now. But if the child never encounters human beings and it's sort of growing up in like a feral environment, there's actually been some crazy examples of that. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this, but there have been like babies that were abandoned in the wild and somehow survived with like a pack of wolves, okay, and never developed the ability to speak. There's this one feral child that was discovered like that, and at a young age they were trying to teach her language basically, but she could never quite get it, even though she didn't have like a mental disability or anything. It's just because the language acquisition was delayed for so long that by the time they tried to instruct her in it, her brain wasn't properly attuned to the concept. So your conscience is something like that. You have a conscience, but if you just ignore it, silence it, try to get away from it, or if it's not properly activated by good moral upbringing, then it can wither away and become very weak or not fully develop at all. So we have the ability for this thing to develop as humans, but it also makes a difference whether it's fully activated and supported by our early childhood upbringing and environment. But yeah, we should try to listen to our conscience. Sometimes people don't like feeling guilty or feeling regret. And people like to have this weird idea of like just no regrets. Whatever I do, I'm fully behind it, even if it was wrong. But you should think about listening to your conscience, because it's not there to harm you. It's to try and direct you toward the right behavior. And in fact, it's coming from within. So it's not like another voice from outside of you giving you a guilt trip. It's you yourself who recognize that you did something that you shouldn't have done, or in another case, that you have a clear conscience, and so you can feel good about your behavior. Okay, so I think that's probably a decent place for us to take a little pause. I don't want to run through too much of the notes on Chapter 9 because there's still 2 more meetings on it, Monday and Wednesday when we come back from our spring break. So I'm going to be grading the assignments you guys have done. I've got a little time to catch up on all of it over our break. So I'll be in touch with you as I finish those over the week. And then on Monday or something, I'm going to send you the information for the final homework assignment. But that's about it for now. So everyone have a great Thanksgiving. I don't know if you're going to be having a big gathering. I know there's been a lot of discussion about whether it's wise to have the typical Thanksgiving table that we've had in the past few years. But I'm sure you'll take responsible actions. Whatever you do, I'm wishing you guys a safe, healthy Thanksgiving, and same for your family. But at any rate, I'll see you guys then. It's going to be nice to have a little time off, but we'll be right back in touch. So continue reading Chapter 9, and we'll finish it when we get back from the break. All right then, thanks again, and have a good one.